I came home early and found my husband with my sister. But what I did, 5 minutes later, ruined both their lives. Hi everyone. Before we get into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel's reach has been dropping a bit, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, free, and helps us keep bringing you new and interesting stories. Your support means the world to us, and together we can grow this channel. Thank you so much. Now let's get to today's story. I'm writing from a temporary account for obvious reasons, and I've changed some details to protect my anonymity. I've never been one for dramatic revelations, but if you're going to sit here and listen to my story, you need to understand something first. Revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quietest thing in the world, settling like dust on everything you once held sacred, until one day you realize you're suffocating in it. My name is Catherine, and 3 years ago I destroyed 2 lives with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a saint. I'm not proud of it. I'm not ashamed of it either. It simply was what needed to happen. Let me start at the beginning, though the beginning feels like someone else's life now. I met David when I was 26, fresh out of graduate school with a master's in business administration and stars in my eyes about conquering the corporate world. He was 32, already established in his law practice, with those steady hands that made you feel like everything would always be all right. We met at a coffee shop near the university, how perfectly mundane, where I was hunched over financial projections and he was reviewing case files. "You look like you're trying to solve world hunger," he said, sliding into the chair across from me without invitation. Normally, I would have bristled at the presumption, but there was something about his smile that made me close my laptop instead. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. The ring was everything I'd dreamed of. Vintage Art Deco, my grandmother's favorite style, though I'd never told him that. He'd somehow intuited it, the way he seemed to intuit so many things about me in those early days. We married on a crisp October afternoon, with golden leaves falling like confetti around us. My sister Emma was my maid of honor, radiant in deep burgundy, her blonde hair twisted into an elegant updo that had taken her stylist 3 hours to perfect. Emma. I should tell you about Emma, because you can't understand the rest without understanding her. She's 2 years younger than me, born when I was still learning to walk, still believing I was the center of my parents' universe. The day they brought her home from the hospital, I remember standing on tiptoes to peer into her bassinet, expecting to feel the love everyone kept telling me I should feel. Instead, I felt something closer to unease, as if I'd glimpsed my replacement. Growing up, Emma was everything I wasn't effortlessly beautiful where I had to work for it, naturally charming where I had to learn it, graceful where I was perpetually knocking things over. She danced through life while I built mine brick by careful brick. Our parents never played favorites, but they didn't need to. Emma was everyone's favorite without trying. Still, we were close. How could we not be? We shared secrets and whispered conversations after bedtime, consoled each other through heartbreaks, celebrated each other's victories. When I got into Stanford, Emma threw me a surprise party. When she landed her first modeling contract at 19, I took her shopping for a celebratory dress. We were sisters in the truest sense, bound by blood and history and genuine affection. Or so I thought. The first few years of marriage were good. David and I bought a house in Westfield, nothing too grand, but with good bones and potential. I threw myself into renovating it, spending weekends at antique shops and estate sales, hunting for the perfect pieces to make it ours. David would find me covered in paint at midnight, my hair tied back with whatever fabric I'd found lying around, and he'd laugh and pull me away from whatever project had consumed me. "The house will still be here tomorrow, Kat," he'd say, using the nickname that only he and Emma ever used. "But I won't be able to carry you upstairs much longer if you don't get some sleep." Those were happy times, or at least I remember them that way now. Memory is unreliable when it comes to happiness. We tend to polish it until it gleams brighter than it ever really did. David's practice was thriving. My own career had taken off too. I'd started as a financial analyst at a mid-sized investment firm and worked my way up to senior portfolio manager. I had a gift for seeing patterns others missed, for understanding the subtle dance of numbers and trends that predicted market movements. It was satisfying work, the kind that challenged me without consuming me entirely. Emma had moved to the city around the same time we bought the house. Her modeling career had plateaued, not failed exactly, but settled into a comfortable mediocrity that paid the bills without making her famous. She'd started taking business classes at night, talking about transitioning into fashion consulting or maybe opening her own boutique. She'd come to dinner every Sunday, bringing wine and gossip and laughter that filled our dining room with warmth. "You two are disgustingly happy," she'd say, watching David and me move around each other in the kitchen with the practiced efficiency of a couple who'd learned each other's rhythms. It's almost offensive. But she'd smile when she said it, and I believed her happiness was genuine. I believed a lot of things then that seem impossibly naive now. The cracks started small, as they always do. David began working later, coming home after I'd already eaten dinner, already settled into the living room with a book or laptop. When I asked about it, he'd run his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd once found endearing, and mutter about a difficult case, about client demands, about the pressures of building a practice. "I'm doing this for us, Kat," he'd say when I pressed, "for our future." I believed him because I wanted to believe him, and because the alternative was unthinkable. Emma started canceling our Sunday dinners more frequently, too. She had dates, she said, or work commitments, or simply needed some time to herself. When she did come, she seemed distracted, checking her phone constantly, jumping at every notification. She'd grown thinner, more angular, her cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass. "Are you eating?" I asked her one evening, watching her push pasta around her plate without taking a bite. "God, Kat, you sound like Mom," she laughed, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine, just stressed about the career change." The business classes she'd mentioned had apparently evolved into a full MBA program, though she was vague about which school, which classes, which professors. When I offered to help, I knew the program directors at several local universities. She waved me off with an airy gesture. "I've got it handled," she said. "Besides, you're busy enough with your own life." There were other signs if I'd been paying attention. The way she and David seemed to avoid being in the same room together when she visited. The way conversations died when I entered a room where they'd been talking. The way Emma had started wearing perfume I didn't recognize, something expensive and subtle that lingered in the air after she left. But I was busy with my own life, just as she'd said. The investment firm had offered me a partnership track, which meant longer hours and more responsibility. I was traveling more, attending conferences, building relationships with potential clients. I was proud of my success, proud of the respect I'd earned in a field dominated by men who'd initially dismissed me as decoration. I should have seen it coming. They say women have intuition about these things, some sixth sense that alerts us to betrayal. But I felt nothing except the ordinary wear of a 7-year marriage, the way passion settles into companionship, the way grand gestures give way to comfortable routines. I thought we were growing up together, maturing into the kind of couple who could weather anything life threw at us. I was an idiot. The day it all unraveled was a Tuesday in November, gray and cold with the promise of winter in the air. I'd flown to Chicago for a client meeting that was supposed to run until late afternoon, but the client's CEO had come down with food poisoning, forcing a cancellation. I could have stayed overnight as planned, done some shopping, treated myself to a nice dinner. Instead, I felt an odd pull toward home, the kind of inexplicable urge that makes you change your plans without really understanding why. The flight back was smooth, and I caught an earlier connection than expected. By 3 o'clock, I was pulling into our driveway, already planning the surprise I'd give David by being home early. Maybe I'd cook his favorite meal, open that bottle of wine we'd been saving for a special occasion. The house was quiet when I entered through the front door, keys jingling softly as I set them on the hall table. David's car was in the driveway, which surprised me. He should have been at the office, but I figured he'd come home for lunch and gotten caught up in something. I kicked off my heels and padded toward the kitchen in stocking feet, thinking I'd start dinner preparations. The house felt different somehow, charged with an energy I couldn't identify. There was music playing softly from upstairs, something classical that David sometimes put on when he was working from home. It was the laugh that stopped me cold. Emma's laugh, bright and breathless, coming from our bedroom. For a moment, I stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, my mind refusing to process what I was hearing. There had to be an explanation. Maybe Emma was helping David with something. Maybe she'd come by to borrow something and had gotten caught up in some ridiculous conversation. But even as I told myself these things, My feet were carrying me upstairs, moving with a dreamlike quality that made everything feel unreal. The music was louder now. Pachelbel's Canon, the same piece that had played during our wedding processional. How perfectly, obscenely appropriate. The bedroom door was ajar, just enough for me to see inside without being seen. What I witnessed in those few seconds will be burned into my memory until the day I die. David and Emma were on our bed, the bed I'd picked out, with sheets I'd chosen, under the wedding quilt my grandmother had made for us. They weren't simply having sex. They were making love with the kind of desperate tenderness that spoke of deep emotion, of something far more than physical attraction. David's hands cradled Emma's face as if she were made of spun glass, and she looked at him with an expression of such complete adoration that it took my breath away. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a casual affair. This was love. Raw, passionate, all-consuming love of the kind that David and I had maybe had once, in the very beginning, before life taught us to be more careful with our hearts. I don't know how long I stood there watching them. Time seemed suspended, as if the universe had paused to let me fully absorb the magnitude of my betrayal. They were so lost in each other that they never noticed me, never sensed my presence in the doorway. Finally, I backed away, moving with the same careful silence I'd used to approach. I went downstairs, collected my keys, and left the house as quietly as I'd entered it. Neither of them ever knew I'd been there. I drove aimlessly for nearly an hour, my mind strangely blank, as if shock had temporarily severed the connection between my thoughts and my emotions. I found myself parked outside a Starbucks in a strip mall 20 minutes from home, staring at other people living their ordinary lives, buying coffee, running errands, making phone calls, completely unaware that my world had just imploded. It was there, sitting in my car with the engine running and the heat blasting, that I made the decision that would define the next 3 years of my life. I wasn't going to scream or cry or confront them in a dramatic scene. I wasn't going to throw clothes out windows or key anyone's car or do any of the things scorned women are supposed to do in movies. I was going to do something far more devastating. I was going to destroy them systematically, methodically, and completely. But first, I was going to learn everything. I spent the next 6 weeks conducting the most thorough investigation of my own life I'd ever imagined possible. I hired a private investigator, not for evidence of the affair, which I didn't need, but for a complete picture of how long it had been going on and what other lies I'd been living with. The truth was worse than I'd imagined. They'd been together for almost 2 years, since shortly after Emma had started her mysterious MBA program, which, it turned out, didn't exist. The tuition money I'd thought our parents were providing had actually been coming from David, filtered through a series of financial maneuvers that would have been impressive if they weren't being used to deceive me. Emma's sudden career change into fashion consulting? Also a fiction. She'd been working part-time at a boutique downtown, but spending most of her time in hotels with my husband. David's late nights at the office were actually late nights with Emma. His business trips were romantic getaways. Even some of our social events had been cover stories for their dates. They'd been planning to tell me everything after the holidays. How considerate of them to let me enjoy one last Christmas before destroying my life. The private investigator also uncovered something else interesting. David had been moving money. Not stealing it exactly, but repositioning assets in ways that would protect him in a divorce. He'd been consulting with a different attorney, someone outside his own firm, about the best strategies for minimizing spousal support. He'd even started a separate business account that he'd managed to keep hidden from me despite our supposedly transparent finances. My husband wasn't just unfaithful, he was calculating. Armed with this information, I began my own preparations. I consulted with 3 different divorce attorneys, eventually settling on Patricia Morse, a woman with a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in defending her clients' interests. I quietly transferred half of our joint savings into an account David didn't know about. I made copies of every financial document we had and stored them in a safety deposit box at a different bank. Most importantly, I started documenting everything. Every lie David told me about working late, every canceled dinner with Emma, every expense that didn't match up with the explanations I'd been given. I created a detailed timeline of their affair using credit card statements, phone records, and hotel receipts. It was like assembling a jigsaw puzzle of betrayal, each piece revealing more of the picture I'd been too trusting to see. During those 6 weeks, I maintained the fiction of our normal life with an actress's skill. I smiled and kissed David goodbye each morning. I asked about his day when he came home late. I called Emma to chat about her non-existent classes and her progress toward her imaginary degree. I hosted our usual Christmas party, watching them avoid each other with the practiced ease of experienced liars. The most surreal part was how good they thought they were at deception. They'd created elaborate systems of fake names and alibis, but they'd been sloppy about the details. Emma would mention a restaurant she'd supposedly visited with a friend, not realizing I could see from David's credit card statement that he'd been there the same night. David would reference a client meeting that, according to his calendar, had never been scheduled. If I hadn't been planning their destruction, I might have found their incompetence almost endearing. I chose Valentine's Day for the reveal, because I've always appreciated irony. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I'd arranged to have divorce papers served to David at his office at exactly 2 p.m. The private investigator would simultaneously deliver a comprehensive portfolio of evidence to Emma at her apartment, along with a letter explaining that David had been planning to leave her once the divorce was finalized. A lie, but a believable one given the financial maneuvering we'd discovered. But the real masterstroke was the timing. I'd also arranged for David's business partners to receive copies of the evidence at exactly the same time. Not because his affair was their business, but because his use of firm resources and client meetings to conduct his personal relationship constituted a serious ethical violation that could result in professional sanctions. At 1:45 p.m., I was sitting in Patricia's office, watching the clock and feeling calmer than I had in months. "You understand there's no going back from this," Patricia said, reviewing the documents one final time. "Once these papers are served and this information is distributed, your marriage is over." "My marriage was over 2 years ago," I replied. "I'm just making it official." At exactly 2 p.m., my phone started ringing. David first, his voice shaking with a combination of rage and panic. "Kat, what the hell is this? There are people at my office with papers and they're saying..." I hung up before he could finish. Emma called 3 minutes later, sobbing so hard I could barely understand her words. "Kat, please, I need to explain." I hung up on her too. Then David's senior partner called, his voice carefully professional as he requested a meeting to discuss some concerns that have been brought to our attention regarding potential conflicts of interest. I took that call. "Mr. Harrison," I said, my voice steady and businesslike. "I appreciate your reaching out. I want you to know that I have no desire to create problems for the firm. My dispute is with my husband's personal conduct, not his professional capabilities. However, I felt you should be aware of the situation so you could address any ethical issues internally." It was a masterful bit of political theater. I sounded reasonable and concerned while providing just enough information to ensure David's career would suffer significant damage. The next few hours were chaos. David came home, Emma came over, and they both tried to explain and apologize and justify what they'd done. I listened to them with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a particularly fascinating tribe. "It just happened," Emma kept saying through her tears. "We didn't mean for it to happen." "But it's been happening for 2 years, I pointed out calmly. "At some point, it stopped being something that just happened and became a choice you were making." David tried a different approach. "I know how this looks, Kat, but you have to understand. Emma and we have something special. It doesn't take away from what you and I had." "Had," I repeated, past tense. How refreshingly honest. They wanted to know what I wanted from them, as if there were some negotiation to be had, some compromise that could undo the last 2 years of lies. Emma suggested we could all sit down and discuss this like adults. David wondered if perhaps we could arrange some kind of separation while we figured things out. I looked at them. My husband and my sister, both disheveled and desperate, both still believing they could charm or manipulate their way out of the consequences of their choices, and felt nothing but a cold, clean sense of completion. "I don't want anything from you," I told them. "I just want you gone." The divorce was finalized 8 months later. David tried to fight the settlement, but Patricia had done her work too well. The evidence of his financial deception, combined with his affair and the professional sanctions he'd received from the Bar Association, left him with very little leverage. I kept the house, most of our savings, and my dignity. Emma tried to maintain the relationship with David, but it crumbled under the weight of reality. Turns out that when your romance is built on secrecy and excitement, it doesn't survive well in the harsh light of everyday life. The financial support David had been providing disappeared with the divorce settlement. Emma's part-time job wasn't enough to support her lifestyle, and she'd burned too many bridges to go crawling back to our parents for help. She moved back to our hometown 6 months after the divorce was final. I heard through mutual friends that she was working as a sales associate at a department store and living in a studio apartment above a pizza place. David left his firm and started a solo practice, but his reputation in the legal community had taken such a hit that he struggled to build a client base. As for me, I threw myself into work with a focus I'd never had before. Without the distractions of maintaining a marriage and a family relationship, I excelled in ways that surprised even me. The partnership I'd been offered became reality within 18 months. I started my own investment consulting firm 2 years after that. I also started traveling not for business, but for pleasure. I spent 3 weeks in Italy, learning to make pasta from ancient nonnas who spoke no English, but communicated perfectly through gestures and smiles. I hiked portions of the Camino de Santiago, carrying nothing but what I needed and discovering muscles I'd forgotten I had. I took a photography course in New Mexico and learned to see light the way artists do. I became, for the first time in my adult life, completely and utterly myself. People ask me sometimes if I regret what I did, if I think I went too far in my revenge. The question always puzzles me, because it assumes I was motivated by anger or hatred. I wasn't. I was motivated by a desire for truth and consequences. David and Emma made choices. Every day for 2 years, they woke up and chose to lie to me, to betray me, to treat me like an obstacle to their happiness rather than a person deserving of honesty and respect. They were adults who understood the potential consequences of their actions. They simply believed they were clever enough to avoid them. I proved them wrong. I don't take pleasure in their downfall, but I don't lose sleep over it either. They're both still alive, still capable of rebuilding their lives and making better choices. Emma could go back to school, develop real skills, create a career based on her own abilities rather than financial support from the men in her life. David could rebuild his practice by focusing on competence and integrity rather than shortcuts and deception. Whether they choose to do those things is up to them. I'm no longer invested in their success or failure. 3 years later, I live in a different house condo downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the river. I have a successful business, good friends, and a sense of peace I didn't know I was capable of feeling. I date occasionally, though I'm in no hurry to marry again. I've learned to trust my instincts, to pay attention to the small inconsistencies that reveal larger truths. I've also learned something about forgiveness that I didn't understand before. Forgiveness isn't about absolving people of consequences or pretending they didn't hurt you. It's about releasing your own need for their suffering to balance the scales. I've forgiven David and Emma, not because they deserved it, but because carrying anger was exhausting and I had better things to do with my energy. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It doesn't mean I have to welcome them back into my life or pretend we can all be friends again. Some betrayals cut too deep to heal completely, leaving scars that never quite fade. Emma reached out to me last year, sending a long email full of apologies and explanations and requests for a chance to talk. She'd been in therapy, she said, and had come to understand how her jealousy and insecurity had led her to make terrible choices. She wanted to make amends, to try to rebuild our relationship. I read the email twice, then deleted it. Not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. I've built a good life without her in it, and I have no desire to invite that kind of chaos back in. David I see occasionally at professional events. We nod politely to each other and make small talk about innocuous topics. He looks older, more worn, but not unhappy exactly. Just diminished, as if his experiences have taught him to dream smaller dreams. I feel nothing when I see him. Not anger, not sadness, not even the faint echo of love. He's become a stranger who happens to share some of my history, like a classmate from elementary school whose name you remember, but whose presence means nothing. And that, I think, is the truest measure of my healing. So here's what I learned from destroying 2 lives and rebuilding my own. Betrayal is not a moment, but a series of choices. And consequences are not revenge, but simply the natural order of things. When people show you who they are, believe them. When they lie to you, don't collaborate in your own deception. And when they force you to choose between your dignity and their comfort, choose dignity every single time. It's a lesson I hope I never have to teach again, but one I'll never forget. The weight of silence, I discovered, is far heavier than the noise of confrontation. But sometimes that weight is exactly what's needed to crush the lies that have been holding up a false life, clearing space for something real to grow in its place. And sometimes, in the quiet that follows destruction, you finally hear the sound of your own voice,